my research concerns interdependencies across governance boundaries. And I'll be talking mostly today about identifying such interdependencies through two different methodological approaches in two different projects. One is my PhD project, which I will be talking mostly about. And I'm about 1.5 years into my PhD, so still very early work. And then I'll touch upon another project, previous project of mine, if I have time, that looks at interdependencies of transnational climate impacts through another methodological approach, identifying interdependencies. And interdependencies across geography and policy domains is a key constituent of complex environmental problems. This is kind of a departure point for my PhD. And they generate incentives for collaboration through the insufficient power or mandate of single actors to independently implement systemic solutions. And water bodies such as this Norrström basin in Sweden, which constitute our case study in my PhD project, they're very systemic objects, and therefore they have all these different problems, right, that interact within their biophysical context. So therefore they also have this high amount of transboundary intertwining across different governance bodies, and therefore, as a response, collaboration tends to happen in governance networks. And the Norrström, so transboundary governance is often the institutional context in which interdependencies occur. The Norrström basin complies under the European Water Directive framework, which was accepted as the most substantial and ambitious piece of European environmental legislation to date, and it was also the first one that really focused on, in Europe, that really focused on environmental sustainability. And it builds on systemic principles of social ecological connections, and it does this or it aims to do this through inclusive transboundary collaboration. But it has been really questioned since its most recent inaction in 2000 in its effectiveness of actually reaching environmental sustainability, since 47% of European water bodies still does not meet the EU standards of good water quality. And implementation in Sweden has mostly focused on the administrative measures of organizing collaboration, but hasn't really targeted for what specific characteristics or for what specific interdependencies that collaboration should happen. So therefore the research question for my PhD is, how does transboundary collaborative governance of problem interdependencies in a hydrological context contribute to improving environmental outcomes? And a problem in this project we define as a difficult governance challenge as it's addressed by actors in their work. So it could be range from policy issues to tasks, actions, situations, and measures. And problem interdependencies we define as governance challenges of interdependent form. So where one problem depends on another problem for its most effective solution. And problems can interdepend differently on each other. For example, to cope with more heavy rains, more stormwater is released, which require stormwater management. And this means that flood measures such as buffer zones could be coordinated with stormwater management since they reinforce the effect of each other in holding and delaying and also treating water. Whereas regulation of water flow and fish connectivity that might instead counteract each other, since there is a contestation about dam building. They might have a counteracting interdependency and therefore trigger conflict, or collaboration might be more difficult in regards to these problems. So therefore, ultimately, it has implications for collaborative effectiveness. And there's been extensive research that's been done on complex problems, with examples from characteristics of collective action problems, and also interdependencies between problems and more policy issues, creating large complexity, with recent examples from interactions between SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals targets, as this example is from. And on the other hand, there's also been extensive research that's been done on transboundary governance and collaborative networks as a way to avoid institutional fragmentation when managing such problems, such complex problems. But there hasn't really been much research that has been integrating these two research areas more in detail. So even though the idea of social ecological fit conceptually emphasized the alignment of these areas, there hasn't been much empirical evidence and detailed theoretical studies that integrate these. And this lack of integration also exists in our study area, the Norrström basin, which is situated close to Stockholm, which is like mid-south Sweden. So following the European Water Directive framework, 17 collaborative institutions are operating with a diversity of actors that participate as governmental or non-governmental actors representing an organization or an interest in these platforms. And they don't have much political power, but they operate in a very polycentric governance structure where most of the political power is held by municipalities or county administrative boards. So transboundary collaboration is highly risk-taking for actors, and since they have to form ties with more unfamiliar partners and it's also more uncertain where the specific outcomes, what the specific outcomes will be. Still, there's been a lot of resources that has been put into collaboration in this area, and at the moment, it's mostly that all actors are collaborating on all different water resource problems. And still, the basin does not meet the EU standards of good water quality. So it's still very difficult here to assess to what extent, in what forms, and targeting what water resource problems collaboration actually has been effective. And it's possible that work has just been too slow because actors don't realize or recognize where they could coordinate better around reinforcing problems, or where they should put emphasis on overcoming counteracting problems. So we try to address this lack of integration by departing from this idea of problem interdependencies and putting that in relation to social networks that forms this multi-level configuration, which is the base of our study, really. But this configuration can be seen to exist in a larger system, which kind of bounds a research model that we will be using in the project. And we will be studying this through a mixed methods approach using mostly qualitative research methods in combination with network analysis. And the idea here is then that problem interdependencies are met by transboundary governance, which produces governance outputs, which hopefully helps to improve environmental outcomes. So this is an overview of our methodological approach. So far, data has been collected through this qualitative triangulation and a survey on what problems constitute the main water governance challenges in the Norrström basin, and then also what intermediate factors constitute threats to the water resource targets. So we did this mapping of factor chains from problems and how they meet targets. And we identified problem interdependencies through what problems link to the same common intermediate factor or indirect factor. So this led to us developing a problem interdependency typology where we identified 4 different problem interdependencies: reinforcing interdependencies, counteracting interdependencies, one directional dependency, and asymmetrical interdependencies. So far we have ended up with empirical data examples of the reinforcing interdependency type and counteracting interdependency type, which I will come back to. This is also very recent data from our survey, where we could see then what problems, so we ended up with defining 16 problems, and this data is on then what problems do actors work most with, what do they consider to be the most important problems, and what do they consider to be the most well-managed problems. This is a conceptual diagram of, it's not so visible here, you don't have to read it, but it's just conceptual diagram of how we went about with the procedure of identifying problem interdependencies. And it created this messy diagram, which we then reduced into problem interdependency configurations. And as I said, so far we have focused on these 2 examples of 2 bidirectional interdependencies, and one which is the interdependency between implementation of wetlands, implementation of buffer zones, and sustainable stormwater management, and the other one being hydropower production, creating fish connectivity, and conservation of cultural heritage. And we also then verified these 2 examples with expert interviews. And in our survey, so these diagrams are very, very recent, but and early, and this is data from 4 collaborative institutions. But we asked how well have interdependencies been, this reinforcing interdependency been addressed, and how well do you think this counteracting interdependency have been addressed? And so there's a slight tendency that actors think that the reinforcing interdependency, that governance performs better in relation to the reinforcing interdependency. So our next step then is to put this in relation to social networks. And our hypothesis is that problem interdependencies can aggravate or reduce the transboundary risk for actors to engage in collaboration. And so the thought is that problem interdependencies might influence social dynamics like allies or adversaries or power positions in social networks, because there might be a less risk to collaborate around reinforcing problems rather than counteracting problems. And but this is yet just hypothesis, so we're about to start testing this. And so these are just conceptual, very simplified configurations at this stage. Let's see if I can use this. Where, for example, if you have a reinforcing interdependency between two problems, that might lead to that these actors find more incentives for social tie formation. Whereas if you have a problem that counteracts two other problems, it might be that this actor that works on the problem that counteracts many other problems is more exposed in the governance network. Similarly, here, if you have a problem that reinforces many other problems, it might be that if an actor working on such problems might be that that actor has a more favorable position in the governance network. So these are like mainly our questions going forward, like how can problem interdependencies influence social structures like allies, adversaries, conflict, power positions in governance networks, and of course also, as we were talking about, endogenous factors will also influence this, but we're interested in see which one is the most dominant explanation. And is collaboration actually effective governance if there's less problem interdependency? We also identified problems where there were less interdependency on other problems. What collaborative or non-collaborative forms are effective for governing different types of problem interdependencies? And in the end, what impact does this have on for environmental outcomes? So this was just a description, early description about how to identify interdependencies through more mixed methods or qualitative process. And I still have some time, right? Yeah. So I'll jump to another project where there's a previous research project of mine where we identified interdependencies of transnational climate impacts using more of a quantitative approach to doing this. So our point of departure here was that previous mappings of climate vulnerability does not consider global interconnections between countries. Like this one, this mapping, which is probably the most seen one, which is the NT-GAIN Index of Climate Vulnerability. And therefore, they present a rather simplified view of climate risk exposure, where developing countries seem to be very highly exposed to climate change, and developed countries seem to be not exposed at all. So we developed a framework that suggests that there are 4 different climate risk pathways, and that transnational climate impacts are transferred between countries through these different pathways. More specifically, financial flows, trade flows, biophysical flows, and human flows. And these flows operate within like a global geopolitical context and can be both transboundary between countries or teleconnected, operating on very large distance. And even though there's starting to become a little bit of a discussion on these second order impacts, there hasn't been any quantitative attempts to investigate these more in detail. So what we did was that we constructed a quantitative index where we gathered data on 9 different indicators that each adhere to one of these climate risk pathways. And we mapped them to find out the spatial distribution of their exposure. And then we aggregated these indicators into a score for each country as a measure of their exposure to climate, transnational climate impacts. So then we could see what specific climate risk pathways constituted the main driver of a specific country's exposure. But when aggregating the index and doing a global mapping of the index, we could also see that the spatial distribution of transnational climate impacts is much more complex than previous mappings of climate vulnerability has shown. And where European countries, it's hard to see here, but such as the Benelux countries, are seen to be in the top 30 countries with highest exposure. And where developing countries might also then face double exposure by being very exposed to both these direct physical climate events and more indirect transnational climate impacts. So that was just a short note on how to use more of a quantitative approach on identifying a different type of interdependencies. That was it for me. I'll be around another week, hopefully. So if you want to chat, just grab me here or send me an email. Thank you.